Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamane. You are watching part of a 7-part series of a public webinar that I gave this past spring on 10 essential observations on guns in America. I hope that you find some value in this work. Everything that I do, I try to provide free with no paywall so that it's free to you. But honestly, this work is not free to me. So if you would like to help support my work, minimally, if you could like and share this work in your own social network so that more people have an opportunity to learn about what I'm doing and the education that I'm trying to give can spread beyond my own built-in social networks. If you would like to financially support the work I do and all of the infrastructure and time that it takes, in the show notes you'll see some options for doing that, notably making contributions through my Buy Me a Coffee platform, which is an alternative to Patreon that you may be more familiar with. So I do appreciate your support. I do hope you find some value in this work, and I do hope that you'll support me in one of these ways that makes sense to you. So let me just begin by welcoming everybody, of course. Also, my sister Ray has her birthday today, so happy birthday to my sister Ray. This is also the 12th anniversary of my Gun Culture 2.0 blog. I haven't had a chance to post yet acknowledging the 12th anniversary, but that's how long I've been at this. I started posting on that blog just because I had no one really to talk to as I was getting started in the world of guns, and it kind of took on a life of its own and really became an important part of the way I approached the study of gun culture and also the writing of my recently published book. So let me get started. I'm going to share screen. Sandy will confirm that I shared the screen properly.
It's good.
It's good. Okay, so here we go. Module 7, final module of 10 essential observations on guns in America. Today, we're going to talk about Wright's observations 9 and 10, his conclusions regarding guns and gun culture. I'll also I'll take the liberty, I guess, as the presenter to talk about what the professor learned as he journeyed through American gun culture. And then hopefully we'll have time for some final Q&A, which I guess could concern what we talk about today in Module 7, as well as probably some general questions that you may have. All right, so let's recap Wright's observations very quickly for those who haven't seen the first 6 modules. Okay, so in Module 1, we covered the fact that half the households in the country own at least one gun. We don't know exactly how many households today. That was what Wright took to be the case in 1995. It's probably about that still. There are 200 million guns already in circulation, give or take a few tens of millions. Now we say that there are 300 to 400 million guns, give or take a few tens of millions. The essence of Wright's point is the same. Modules 2 and 3, we covered observation 3. Most of those 200 million guns are owned for socially innocuous sport and recreational purposes, and observation 4, many guns are also owned for self-defense against crime. Of course, given Gun Culture 2.0, the center of gravity of gun culture has shifted away from sport and recreation much more toward self-defense. So this is a modification we definitely have to make to Wright's observations 30 years later. We continued with observation 4. Some are indeed used for that purpose. Whether they're actually safer or not, many people certainly seem to feel safer when they have a gun. Here we talked about defensive gun use, how we understand defensive gun use, the downside risk of defensive gun ownership, and so on. So, Wright here is correct in part, but we needed to elaborate what he had to say quite considerably. Module 5 were observations 5 and 6. The bad guys don't get their guns through customary retail channels. Still true today. And observation 6, the bad guys inhabit a violent world. A gun often makes a life or death difference to them. Same as today, right? Bad guys, just like good guys with guns, would rather be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Module 6 last week, everything the bad guys do with their guns is already against the law, and demand creates its own supply. So here we talked about gun violence and gun violence prevention, the new developments in gun control, and I tried to present what I called a gun-friendly approach to gun violence prevention. And I think that there are certainly ways that we can address the wicked problem of gun violence in ways that don't create blanket restrictions on gun owners overall. And I think that was James Wright's point and desire back when he first wrote his essay. All right, so module 7, we've got 2 observations again. Observation 9, guns are neither inherently good nor inherently evil. Guns, that is, do not possess a teleology. And observation 10, his final observation is that guns are important elements in our history and culture, and that has certain implications. As seems to be frequently the case, I want to take Wright's observations in the reverse order that he poses them. So let me first deal with this question of guns in U.S. history and culture. So according to Wright, gun control advocates are frequently taken aback by the stridency with which their seemingly modest and sensible proposals are attacked. But from the gun culture's point of view, restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms amount to the systematic destruction of a valued way of life and are thus a form of cultural genocide. Now, maybe like you, I bristle initially at that strong language, the notion of cultural genocide and systematic destruction of a valued way of life. But I think it is the case that there are some, at least, who are gun control advocates or gun violence prevention advocates who really do not want there to be a gun culture. They think the fewer guns in circulation, the less involvement people have with guns, the better. And here I think of a newer gun control organization, and here I won't really call it a gun violence prevention organization. I sort of reject the rebrand in this case because it really is a gun control organization. It's called Project Unloaded. It was founded by the woman who used to be the head of the Joyce Foundation. And those of you who are on the inside of what's going on in this world, you know that the Joyce Foundation is a Midwest or Chicago-based philanthropy that funds a lot of gun violence prevention research. So she left the Joyce Foundation and was involved in founding Project Unloaded. So you can see, to stop gun violence, which, obviously that's something that, we're all against, or I would hope most of us are against that, so we can endorse a desire to stop gun violence. We need to tell a different story about guns. Guns make us less safe. And since guns make us less safe, and here you might hear an echo of what I call the standard model of the irrationality of defensive gun ownership. Right? If guns make us less safe, then the wise choice is to choose to live unloaded. And where this intersects with this idea of a destruction of a way of life and cultural genocide is that one of the approaches, if not the main approach, that Project Unloaded is taking toward getting people to live their life without guns is by trying to get to kids, right? So a lot of their advertising, a lot of their material is directed to kids, like this Project Snug, right? Or the Snug campaign, which stands for Safer Not Using Guns. So Project Unloaded's Snug campaign reaches teens on the social media platforms where they spend their time with a simple message: we're safer not using guns. And they say that it's working based on the engagement that they're getting with these social media campaigns, right? So they're really, not saying you shouldn't use guns criminally, you shouldn't use guns irresponsibly, right? Some of the things that I talk about gun safety as safety with guns, this is really a pure safety from guns approach, that there's no such thing as safe gun ownership. And by intervening in the socialization of kids into responsible gun ownership, they really are trying to take away a way of life that is valued by many, many people in this country, right? Whether it's cultural genocide or not, I'll leave that term to you. We're having a lot of debates as a society right now over the definition of genocide. So I'll leave that, but hopefully you can see how this example represents, why gun culture, right, does feel somewhat strident when people are saying, "Oh, just here's just a modest and sensible pros, common sense gun control." Right? This goes, I think beyond that, and is why it's a very interesting organization to watch. Wright also writes that when in the interest of fighting crime, we advocate restrictions on their right to own guns, we are casting aspersions on gun owners' decency as though we somehow hold them responsible for the crime and violence that plague this nation. Is it any wonder they object often vociferously to such slander? And I think those of you who have been following along, either with my work in general or these public webinars in particular, know that I don't get up in arms, very often, right? I don't get outraged very often. I try to promote light over heat, but in the wake of the San Bernardino mass murder, the New York Times published a front page editorial on the gun epidemic. And as you can see in this December 2015 blog post, they morally shamed gun owners, right? They said basically, if you own AR-15 rifles, right, you should be ashamed of yourself. You're behaving immorally. And again, I think this is exactly what Wright is speaking to here, right? Casting aspersions on people's decency for the fact of owning firearms generally or owning particular types of firearms. So if you want to see me, uh, in what amounts to anger for me, you can read that particular blog post. It's still on my Gun Culture 2.0 blog. But, one of the ways I think about this, and I write about this in this way in Gun Curious, is nobody holds me responsible for drinking and driving tragedies, right? If I'm at the bar and someone is next to me at the bar, over consumes alcohol, gets in their car and drives home and kills somebody on the way home, nobody holds me morally responsible for that person's action because I too was sitting at that bar drinking and perhaps also drove home, but not under the influence of alcohol, right? Not being drunk when I'm driving home. And so, I think that there is such a thing as responsible drinking and responsible driving, so long as you don't bring those two things together. And I show a case in point here. I drove around in my car with 10 or probably I think 12 cases of bourbon, right? Nothing wrong with that because I wasn't sitting there consuming bourbon at the time. And if some other person killed somebody while they were drinking and driving, the fact that I'm driving around with a half of a barrel of bourbon in my car doesn't mean anything about my moral standing, right? So here I think, Wright is exactly correct when he identifies why is it that gun owners react so negatively to these efforts to hold us responsible or morally shame us responsible for the irresponsible actions or the criminal actions of other people. We don't do it in every area of life for sure. All right, guns do not possess a teleology. So some of you may not know what teleology is. It comes from the Greek word telos, which means the end. And so teleology is the end or purpose of some object or phenomenon. So if we talk about the teleology of a gun, we're talking about the purpose for which the gun exists, right? And Wright rejects this idea of teleology, I think, in part. And here we probably need a little bit of clarification. So Wright says any firearm is neither more nor less than a chunk of machined metal that can be put to a variety of purposes. all involving a small projectile hurtling at high velocity downrange to lodge itself in a target. So here he's, basically saying that, guns don't have a particular purpose, except perhaps to hurl a projectile at high velocity at a target. So he says, by definition, all guns are designed to kill, that is, to throw a projectile downrange to lodge in a target. Trying to sort firearms into inherently bad and inherently good categories seems fundamentally silly, right? So, he's rejecting the idea that guns have a teleology in the sense that the purpose of guns are good or bad, right? The purpose of guns are to hurl projectiles at whatever we're trying to make that projectile impact. So here, again, we see some other folks kind of jumping in with some, clarification to say that, maybe guns do have a teleology in the sense of the purpose of guns, according to political scientist Tim Luke, is to shoot, right? That is what guns are designed to do. If they have a teleology, that is what it is. But this is a very different teleology than what many people who are on the gun skeptic side, who think of the purpose of guns being to kill, right? So the purpose of guns is not to kill. That's not the teleology of guns, although they can be put to that purpose, both for good and for ill. And again, also Evan Selinger. Luke and Selinger are both readings that are available in the course materials if you wanted to follow up, or if you're wondering where I'm getting this material from. So Evan Selinger talks about a gun's mechanisms were built for the purpose of releasing deadly projectiles outward, right? And here, we could probably bracket the deadly and just say the purpose of releasing projectiles outward. For the most part, a gun's excellence simply lies in its capacity to quickly fire bullets. And here, again, we can bracket quickly because it's really its capacity to fire bullets that can reliably pierce or impact targets, right? Again, this is, if we take out some of those words, a fairly neutral description of the purpose, the end, or the teleology of a gun, right? And this is, again, both different from its purpose being to kill, but also, Selinger makes the point that using the butt of a gun to hammer the nail into a wanted poster, a gun can be used for that, but that is not a gun's purpose. That's an ancillary use of a gun. So again, Wright is rejecting the teleology of a gun in the sense of being inherently good or bad, but we can recognize that guns do have a particular purpose. They're designed to do a particular thing, but that particular thing that guns are designed to do is neutral, right? And because the purpose that guns are designed for is morally neutral, we get what I call a paradox of guns, right? That guns can be used for multiple and contradictory purposes, within what they are designed for. So here, let me just read a section from the conclusion, the introduction to the conclusion of my book, really, where I kind of try to articulate this idea of the paradox of guns. And I say, if there is a single overarching lesson I've learned in my search for the truth about American gun culture, it is the importance of understanding that guns are not one thing, but many, and paradoxical at that. They are fun and frightening, dangerous and protective, diffuse and concentrated, unifying and divisive, attractive and repulsive, interesting and controversial, useful and useless, good and bad, and neither good nor bad. That is to say, guns are not inherently anything. They take on different meanings according to the various purposes to which people put them. This is the paradoxical nature of guns. And I actually talk about this with respect to a particular type of gun in chapter 4 on the AR-15 and the question of whether AR-15s are properly understood as a weapon of war. So I say there's nothing inherent in any of these widely owned rifles, AR-15s, that make them weapons of war. A rifle in the hands of a civilian harvesting game is a hunting rifle. The same weapon in a competitive shooter's hands is a sporting rifle. The same rifle in the hands of a civilian defender defending herself is a defensive firearm. In the hands of a mass shooter, it is a murder weapon. And in the hands of a soldier in battle, it is a weapon of war. Of course, for those people who primarily associate AR-15s with the latter two categories of use, mass shooters and soldiers, it is easy to think of them essentially as weapons of war, right? So again, here I think sort of along the lines of Wright's argument that guns don't have a teleology, the AR-15 doesn't have a teleology other than to propel projectiles down range at whatever the rifle is being pointed at, but the meaning of the rifle is in its use. So does that mean that guns are just tools, right? This is something that I certainly hear quite a lot within the gun culture as a kind of defense, one of these things saying, that firearms don't have a particular purpose. They don't have a particular positive or negative teleology. They're just a tool, right? Something to hurl projectiles. And I'm just noticing in this picture, I apologize to those of you who are being triggered by my open dust cover there. I'm not a rifle guy, so I'm just noticing it now. Maybe I'll go back and edit this and replace that photo with another one. In any event, Sandy and I at the NRA meeting were sitting at the bar at the Omni Hotel, and we met this guy, Ring of Freedom NRA member, which means he's a big donor. He was there, super excited to see Donald Trump speak. And I introduced myself to him. I was telling him about my book. I said it's about the process by which I became a gun owner. And his response as a multi-generational Texas rancher was, that he always finds it weird when people characterize themselves as gun owners, because although he owns guns, he doesn't think of being a gun owner as at all part of his identity, because, as he said, guns are just tools. They're just like forks. Okay, so I understand why people talk about guns as just being tools, right? This has to do, with that idea that they don't have a positive or negative teleology, that the meaning of gun is in its use. If you use it simply as a tool, then that's all it is. At the same time, don't ever bring a fork to a gunfight. Okay. So, guns are tools, but they are not just any tools, right? Here we get back to that other understanding of teleology. They are purpose designed to hurl projectiles at whatever they're being pointed at high speeds, right? So, as the folks at Open Source Defense say, guns are dangerous, right? Guns are inherently dangerous tools, and that's a feature, not a bug, right? The point isn't to try to make guns less dangerous. If you do make a gun less dangerous, then you're actually sort of getting at undermining their teleology, right? We have to accept that this is part of what guns are and what guns do, and especially if you are a hunter, right, or if you are a defensive gun owner, right? These are deadly weapons, as Tom Gibbons says. If they weren't, they wouldn't be useful to us at all, right? And so, there are many tools that can be dangerous. I've had, on my YouTube channel talking about this issue and talking about chainsaws, the, danger of chainsaws and other tools. But, in my view, a fork can be used as a weapon, but it is not as effective a weapon as a gun is, because that is not in the fork's teleology. So this really raises the question of what is called in the scholarly literature firearms instrumentality, right? According to the authors of this book, crime is not the problem, lethal violence in America. When we compare the United States to other industrialized nations, in most categories of nonviolent crime, burglary, theft, and other property offenses, American crime rates are comparable or even lower in some cases than the crime rates in other countries. So this general trend holds true when we even compare cities of roughly the same size in different countries, right? So this is why they're saying the problem in the United States isn't crime. Our crime rates and arguably even our violent crime rates are similar to other uh, advanced industrialized countries. The problem is the lethality of the violence that we have in this country. So only when it comes to lethal violence does the United States outpace other Western nations with homicide rates many, many times greater, right? So that disjuncture between nonviolent crime rates, violent crime rates, and homicidal crime rates or homicide rates, that's where the US really stands out. And they attribute this to firearms instrumentality, right? We have so many more firearms in the United States and in these other countries, and that guns make violent situations more lethal, right? And, it's worth pointing out, this is just kind of an aside, right, that, guns are actually involved in a very small proportion of crimes. The aggregate numbers are still, pretty staggering, right? So 38,000 rapes or sexual assaults were committed with a firearm, but that's only 5% of all rapes and sexual assaults. Similarly, aggravated assault with injury, only 42,000 of 353,000 of those crimes were committed with a gun, right? So, guns are a very small portion of all of the violence and other crimes that are committed in the United States. But when guns are used, they turn these situations into lethal ones, right? So, again, you can kill someone with a fist, stick, knife, or gun, as people say, but guns make it easier to deploy lethal force, right? There are cases where people have killed others with their fist, right? You can beat someone to death, you can knife them to death, right? But if you want to make this as easy as possible, right? I think the gun is the best choice. Again, this is why, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight, right? You don't bring your fist to a gunfight. Um, so people without guns injure people, whereas people with guns tend to kill people. This is firearm instrumentality. And if you have a larger caliber gun with a greater capacity, this makes homicide more likely, right? So in the days of the 5-shot 32 revolver, you could definitely kill some people, and I'll have something to say about that. But if you have a 17 round magazine in a pistol chambered for 9mm, right, that's going to just make the killing a lot easier. All right, non-fatal shootings are failed homicides, are also called almost homicides, right? So again, having more or more powerful rounds in the gun matters in terms of whether those things are aggravated assaults or homicides versus being homicides. Now, this raises the question about substitution. I can't really get into all of the technicalities of that, but this is something that scholars working in this area do try to control for, right? So if you don't have access to a firearm, but you have a very strong intent to kill somebody else, you'll just substitute a different weapon, right? This is sort of the same idea as substitution effects in terms of suicide, right? So if you take guns away from someone who is suicidal and they have a very strong intention to commit suicide, then they can substitute a different means for that. But again, the unique nature of firearms makes it so that substitution is only partial, right? So some of the people who would kill somebody else if they, had enough intention, or someone who had enough intention to take their lives would substitute, but not everybody would engage in substitution. Now, so the question of intentionality, I think, is really interesting. Again, hard to establish, but this is a very interesting study that was published looking at data on assaults in Jersey City, New Jersey from 1992 to 1996 and looked at assault outcomes by firearms type. So this here on the left is what the assault outcomes look like for semi-automatic pistols, right? So of all of the people who threatened somebody else, 69% of those cases did they attack the other person, right? And 31% of the cases they didn't attack the other person, they only threatened them, right? Of those who engaged in attack, right, 58% injured the person they were attacking, and 42% of the cases the person being attacked wasn't injured. And in 16% of those cases in which the person was injured, the person was killed. And in 84% of the cases, the person lived. Okay, so that's the pattern for semi-automatic pistols. What's interesting is if you look at the pattern for revolvers, right? So again, very similar numbers, right? So certain number of people were threatened, 68% of people were attacked compared to 69% with the semi-auto, right? Among the people attacked, 56% were injured, very similar to the semi-automatic rate of injury. But look at the deaths. 25% of the people who were attacked by an assailant with a revolver died. And this is a higher proportion of death than the deaths of people who were attacking with a semi-automatic pistol, right? So intentionality does matter, right? Perhaps even skill matters. Maybe if you're a criminal and you're carrying a revolver, you're more skilled at using that revolver, right? Whatever the case may be, it's not as simple as just saying semi-automatic pistols are more lethal than revolvers, right? Now, this doesn't talk in any detail about the type of semi-automatic pistol, the type of revolver, but on its face, this does sort of pump the brakes some on the question of intentionality, and makes us realize that, what the person is trying to accomplish matters alongside at least what type of weapon they have while they're doing their business. This also came up in an interesting piece that was published about the city of Chicago back in 2018, and they were looking at changes in homicide deaths from 1992 and into 2016, not over that period, but in 1992 and in 2016, and they were trying to figure out this issue of instrumentality, right? Were guns becoming more lethal over this period of time? Because you can imagine 1992, what types of guns would be common on the streets of Chicago, and in 2016, the types. But so in 1992, homicide victims were hit an average of 2.5 times. By 2016, homicide victims were hit an average of 4.2 times. So the number of shots being taken by homicide victims had increased almost by 200%, almost doubled over that period of time, right? Also in 1992, 3 gunshot victims had been hit 10 or more times, and by 2016, 7 victims had been hit 10 or more times. So again, a doubling of that. So this, to I think the authors, the researchers, was indicative of the fact that people in 2016 are carrying more high capacity pistols than they were in 1992. So people are getting hit more often because of that increased capacity. But again, on the intentionality side, right? So moving from instrumentality to intentionality, of those killed by a single bullet, a larger percentage in 1992 than in 2016 suffered a wound to the body rather than the head, right? So some people were killed with a single shot. In 1992, those people were more likely to be shot in the body, whereas in 2016, they're more likely to be shot in the head. And I'm thinking, if people are being shot in the head, that is a strong intention to kill somebody, right? You don't shoot someone in the head unless you're intending to kill someone. Okay. In 1992, 5% of homicide victims were killed sitting in a vehicle. In 2016, 20% were killed sitting in a vehicle. So a 400% increase in the number or the proportion of victims who were killed sitting in their cars. So again, to me, this speaks to intentionality, right? It's much more a situation basically of kind of assassination. Again, and if you're seeing this pattern, it really speaks, I think, much more to intentionality than instrumentality, right? Because, if I intend to shoot someone, to kill someone, and, shoot them in their head or shoot them when they're in their car, I can be using, low capacity magazine. I could be using a revolver, whatever the case may be. So, again, I do, think that if I have 17 rounds of 9mm in a semi-auto, that, maybe I'm better off than if I have, 5 rounds of 22. But I can certainly do a lot of damage with 5 rounds of 22 if I wanted to. The other question that I really, can't get into here very much, but is something that I hope all of you, think about, and maybe in conversation someday you can instruct me about, or we can reflect about this together, is this idea that guns don't kill people, right? The finger pulls the trigger and shooter intentionality matters. And you might recognize this picture of a rifle that was found after something like 130 years sitting in Great Basin National Park in Nevada. That gun never shot anybody on its own. It just sat there for 130 years, right? But what if guns change our intentionality, not when they're sitting away from us, but when we're actually using guns? Can guns actually have a coercive power over us, right? This is a logic that has been put forward by some people, right, under the rubric that people with guns kill people. And it's not that the finger pulls the trigger, but there are certain senses in which the trigger pulls the finger, right? The gun compels us to use it when it's in our possession, right? It changes our intentionality. So philosopher Don Ida says the human gun relation transforms the situation from any similar situation of a human without a gun, right? A human with a gun is not just human plus gun. It has a kind of fundamental ability to alter the situation. And the philosopher, he's actually a sociologist of science, Bruno Latour, says you are different with a gun in your hand, and the gun is different with you holding it, right? So there's an interaction that takes place between humans and technology, right? And if you think about, the way that we interact with lots of different technologies, right? We are different with a cell phone, a smartphone in our hand, and the smartphone is different because we're holding it, right? So a smartphone that's sitting on our desk is different than a smartphone in our hand. I think this is somewhat provocative. I do think that human beings interact with technologies. I don't think that, it makes us, basically victim to the firearms or not having any control over the firearms. But we may actually do things or think things, feel things, when we have a firearm in our hand that we don't or wouldn't if we don't have a firearm in the hand. And there's lots of people wearing orange jumpsuits, who are wearing orange jumpsuits because they interacted with a firearm relative to other people in ways that they might not have otherwise. All right. I think that's what I have to say about Wright's main observations. I want to take the liberty, I guess, or the discretion as the instructor here to talk a little bit about my book Gun Curious, coming out on June 1st, and also talk about the lessons I learned from my surprising journey inside America's gun culture. So this is the table of contents for the book. The book really does try to weave together my personal experiences and sociological observations about how I became a gun owner, how I matured as a gun owner, how I became a responsible gun owner, and what I learned in the process. So, I begin by telling the story in the introduction of how I became a gun owner. And then I turn to my sort of core idea that guns are normal and normal people use guns in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, I ground that cultural view of the normality of guns in the anthropological normality of the human weapon relationship, something I take from Randy Mian, who's the head of the liberal gun owners. And I try to put some flesh on that idea with reference to, my favorite gun related TV show, which is Top Shot. From there, I move on to talking about how I became a gun super owner in chapter 3, how and why, and really how easy it is to be a gun super owner. And then chapter 4, really talking about ownership of a particular firearm, the AR-15, and how I have become comfortable living with this firearm. Put my experience of becoming a concealed carry permit holder in the context of the liberalization of concealed carry laws in chapter 5. And then in chapter 6, I really take up this question of risk and gun ownership, recognizing that, guns, because they're not like any other tool, right? The gun can be used in a way similar to a fire extinguisher, but a gun is much more dangerous than a fire extinguisher for reasons that I hopefully have established already. But still, the idea that it is better to have a gun and not need it than to need a gun and not have it is the basic fundamentals of Pascal's wager with respect to firearms. Chapter 7 continues on the theme of risk, but here looking at the risk factors for negative outcomes. And I really, particularly like this chapter because I'm able to talk about Michael Sodini, who I think is doing amazing work in the gun space with Walk the Talk America. And, I think that the work that gun owners are doing to reduce the risks of negative outcomes like suicide is really important and gets underplayed generally, I think, in the scholarly literature, especially. And then the final empirical chapter looks at the training path that I took to become a more responsibly armed citizen. And of course, the conclusion is what the professor learned. So let me jump into those lessons. Quick check of the time. I actually should be okay to hopefully get through all of these, by 7 o'clock. If I rush, I apologize, but I really want to get to the funnest part of the webinars, which is the Q&A. All right, so the 5 lessons I learned, just to review in advance: shooting is fun, violence can be the answer, gun culture is inclusive, but I may never feel fully at home there, gun owners are and should be and can be more responsible, and then reclaiming conversations with fellow citizens about guns. Okay, lesson 1, shooting is fun. As some of you know, I didn't shoot a gun for the first time because I thought it would be fun. I wanted to shoot a gun because I thought they were dangerous, and they seemed to be all around me here in the state of North Carolina. So I wanted to know how they worked, how we would know if it was loaded, how to unload it, how to make it safe, and so on. But the funny thing that happened on the way to the range, or on my first trip to the range, is that within the first 50 rounds I ever shot, which were the 50 rounds I shot on that day in January of 2011, I had fun. I felt challenged. And so even though that wasn't my intention going into the event, that was certainly the result of going shooting for the first time. And, so recognizing sort of the power of my first experience shooting guns, and when I began teaching my Sociology of Guns course in 2015, I came up with the idea of taking a field trip to the gun range on the first day of class, right? So even before we meet as a class on campus, in a classroom at Wake Forest, we go to the gun range, and the students are given the opportunity, although they're not required, to shoot a variety of guns. And so the purpose here isn't to convert people to guns as I was converted in my own experience, right? But to give them an experiential understanding of guns, right? Whatever they feel about guns, at least they have some experiential understanding of what guns are, how they work, why some people might like them, why maybe they don't like them. But a sample comment from a student's post-trip reflection paper highlights the fact that many of the students, especially perhaps surprisingly, students who don't have any experience shooting guns, have fun during this field trip. So let me just read a snippet of a student's post field trip reflection paper. I was surprised at the amount of joy I felt when I first hit the target. I almost felt as though I was on an adrenaline rush after a long run. In contrast to my fear and uneasiness based on my prior knowledge of guns, I really enjoyed myself and had fun not only shooting, but especially hitting the target. Very interesting. So the range field trip is actually so well known in my department that one student asked me to take her to the range because she couldn't take my course. And as you can see from this picture, she had a great time. I've taken my son's high school foreign exchange student from Argentina to the range, tons of my friends, and actually, most recently, my older sister from California, who'd never shot a gun before when she was visiting last week. We went out to the range and had a good time. And these all confirm the saying that I don't know who coined, but I attribute to John Hauptman of Filster Holsters, that there's no such thing as an anti-gun gun range. All right, lesson 2, violence can be the answer. So I recognize, I think, with James Wright, that very few people challenge innocuous, quote unquote, innocuous reasons for owning guns like recreational target shooting, that the concerns really focus more on defensive gun ownership and use. And for me, this suggests that the problem isn't really guns per se, but something even more fundamental, which is the potential for violence that guns embody, right? So if it was guns per se, people wouldn't have, give certain types of shooting a pass, right? It really is the capacity for violence that is the problem. And one of my biggest surprises in journeying inside gun culture was really learning that violence can be the answer. So when I was in second grade, I made a drawing for a class assignment. It hung in my bedroom through my high school years, as you can see from this photo. And thanks to my mother, I still have the drawing. The rudimentary artwork depicts me as Martin Luther King on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, speaking to the gathered crowd. And in the assignment itself, my mom's neat handwriting around the picture gives the prompt, I have a dream that one day, and my response, I can do what Martin Luther King did. I've fallen well short of this dream, but King's quest for social justice really informed my liberal sentiments and continues to inspire me to this day. In particular, I was always fixated on the political practice of nonviolent civil disobedience. But I also, over time, have come to see that nonviolence as a political strategy and pacifism as a life philosophy are not the same thing. Now, an old adage among conservatives, at least, is that a liberal is just a conservative who has been mugged by reality. Many of you have heard that one. But the thing is, I'm still a liberal, although an incident at my apartment complex parking lot back in 2010, which I discuss at length in my book, fundamentally altered my perspective on many things, including perhaps especially on violence. Faced with a threat, I felt a desire well up inside me to protect my children, and I envisioned myself defending them by any means necessary, including whatever violence I could use. So the fact that I responded to this parking lot confrontation by becoming a defensive gun owner definitely bothers, I think, some of my liberal friends and colleagues, right? Many of my liberal friends and colleagues will see it as allowing me to, and I'll quote my fellow sociologist, Angela Stroud. So defensive gun ownership allows me, quote, to identify with hegemonic masculinity through fantasies of violence and self-defense. Now, again, some of this liberal resistance is due to discomfort with guns, but I think the gun masks an even more fundamental reservation about the capacity for violence that guns represent, and indeed, I think about violence itself. So, my heart and my mind tell me that I don't ever want to use violence against somebody unnecessarily. And again, going back to my childhood worship of Martin Luther King and his ethic of nonviolence, I believe, as Tim Larkin says, that violence is rarely the answer. But Larkin says, and I think King would agree, when violence is the answer, it's the only answer, right? Under those very limited circumstances. And in truth, my fellow liberals are not really opposed to guns or to violence altogether. We just prefer to outsource that to law enforcement. Now, where I think I have come to differ with my fellow liberals is in my recognition that there are limited circumstances under which violence can be virtuous. All right, lesson 3. Gun culture is inclusive, but I may never feel fully at home there. So I've long argued that defensive gun culture has the potential to be inclusive because safety and security are universal concerns, and some part of the population will respond to those concerns by owning firearms. Now, at this point in my journey, I still do think that gun culture is inclusive, but I have to admit that I may never feel fully at home in gun culture. So in January 2021, my work was interrupted by a text message from a friend that said, they are storming the Capitol. Now, it took me a second to realize who the they was in that text message, but I soon realized it was people who wanted to, as they would say, save America by overturning Trump's defeat in the November 2020 presidential election. And I was sorry, but not really surprised to see images of Confederate battle flags with AR-15s and "Come and Take It" emblazoned on the side of them, flying alongside all manner of Trump MAGA flags that day. And every negative stereotype of gun culture was fully on display at that moment. Aggrieved white men firmly rooted in a racially unequal past, flying the flag of their totemic emblem and rallying cry. At the same time, I responded to those who argued that gun culture as a whole was to blame for this, for the events of January 6th, because they were really making a causal claim that didn't reflect the broader reality of guns and gun culture and gun ownership in America. Tens of millions of Americans who own guns hear the exhortations of gun rights groups. They're exposed to gun industry advertising. They engage in social activities around guns with other gun owners, but they're not infected by this alleged insurrectionist virus. So these two responses I have to January 6th really highlight this duality of repulsion and attraction I experience relative to gun culture. They also reflect the kind of dual realities in which I live. Again, I've lived most of my life outside of gun culture, right? And yet most of my days are engaging to some extent, either personally, sort of in the real world or virtually with gun owners and gun culture. And this hybrid identity of liberal professor slash gun owner in theory means that I have two different tribes I can call my own, but in reality, I often feel somewhat homeless, right? Floating between these two different social worlds. So, like many who have come into the gun culture in recent years, since the great gun buying spree of 2020 plus, I was a new non-traditional gun owner when I began this journey in 2011. And every year I do become more comfortable in gun culture, although there are still aspects of it that make me feel less than fully at home. So, just to uh, take you to Dallas this past weekend for the NRA annual meeting, there was a van that was driving around. That's actually uh, like an LED projection screen that somebody obviously rented to express their views of the ATF. But I think that if you are against the ATF, there's probably better ways, more inclusive ways to express that than using someone's sexual orientation as a slur. And I was particularly attuned to this because I spent some time at the meeting with Chris Chang, right? So this photo actually is from the first time I really met Chris Chang and had a chance to talk to him, get to know him. It appears in my book, Gun Curious. But I spent some time at the NRA annual meetings with Chris Chang, and I wonder what he thinks when he sees a van driving around outside the meetings, using sexual orientation as a slur. And I certainly saw lots of people laughing and taking photos and expressing appreciation for the sentiments expressed. Right? Not to say that they are necessarily homophobic, but they appreciated putting the ATF down and weren't so concerned about the manner in which the ATF was putting down. So again, attraction and repulsion for me. All right, the fourth lesson I have is that gun owners are and should be and can be more responsible. So again, in the wake of this great gun buying spree of 2020 plus, the Atlantic staff writer David Frum made a particularly ardent but not exceptionally unique argument that responsible gun ownership is a lie. Right. So if you can't see the URL there, let me enlarge it for you so you can see. So I appreciated Frum for saying something that a lot of people think, but I think are a little bit shy to say. Right? They don't want to say this in their public stances for kind of political purposes, but I think a lot of people in the gun control movement really do think that there's no such thing as responsible gun ownership because guns are, fundamentally dangerous. Now, in my view, responsible gun ownership is no more a lie than responsible drinking or responsible driving, even though we recognize that there are times when people will irresponsibly combine those two things. I show in the book, most gun owners will not shoot themselves or another person, either intentionally or accidentally, and most guns will not also be used to injure or kill people. Right? So the argument that responsible gun ownership is a lie is belied by the empirical reality of guns and gun ownership in America. Now, of course, gun owners should be responsible, and we can be more responsible. And there are many people in the gun culture who are working toward this goal of more responsible gun ownership, including Claude Werner on the left here and Michael Sodini on the right, both of whom I discuss in the chapter on risk of negative outcomes in the book. Claude's work as the tactical professor on negative outcomes itself, and Mike's work with Walk the Talk America to bridge the gap between guns and mental health represent, I think, the best of responsible gun ownership in America. But in my experience, I think few people in the gun community have pushed the idea of responsible gun ownership more and for longer than Rob Pincus. And Rob's guest lectured several times in my Sociology of Guns course. Typically, he comes in to talk about gun owner responsibility and especially negative outcomes like suicide. Last fall, Rob offered to send me one of his new Avidity Arms PD-10s to use at my class field trip to the gun range for Sociology of Guns. And I was really happy when I opened the box for the gun and saw that he has with inside the box with every gun he ships, as I understand it, Walk the Talk America information card and sticker. But I was really most impressed when I took the gun out of the case and I saw these words cut into the foam, in the custom foam that is part of the uh, gun shipping. Rights come with responsibilities. And that's a position that I would really love to see more people in the gun community embrace in an open way, in a very forward way, to reinforce the idea that gun owners do care about responsibility in a very fundamental way. Oh, I'm a little bit over, but I'm coming in to the conclusion here. Okay, the fifth and final lesson is that we need to have civil conversations with our fellow citizens about guns, right? And I'm really concerned about the level of polarization that we're seeing in America today, and guns as a wedge issue in that polarization and a real flashpoint in our heated debates. Over the last few years, though, I've had the opportunity to engage in with groups of people that include, very diverse audiences, including people who are gun skeptics. And these experiences actually give me hope that we can have civil conversations and productive conversations with people about guns despite our differences. And I just have one case in point that I want to talk about from July of 2023, when I participated in a public panel that was sponsored by the Vail Symposium, and it was called Conversations on Controversial Issues with Clay Jenkinson. The topic was gun violence, and I actually ended up on this panel because the person who's sitting to my right in this picture, Josh Horwitz, who you may know as the longtime executive director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, and since 2022, he's been co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. He recommended to the Vail Symposium that I participate in the panel because I did hold different views about guns to him. So I think that was really to his credit. But in 2 hours, obviously, we couldn't solve the wicked problem of gun violence, but that wasn't even the point of the symposium. The point of the symposium was to have a conversation. And I like the framing of this as a conversation rather than as a debate, because nobody wins a conversation, right? Conversations are geared toward mutual understanding, and they help us to build empathy and concern for the experiences and feelings of other people is really crucial to building a stronger democratic culture from the ground up, right? Empathy helps us to see other people as fellow citizens. Now, the moderator of the Vail Symposium, Clay Jenkinson, is noted as a first-person historical interpreter of Thomas Jefferson, right? And one thing I like that he did, he wasn't in character as Thomas Jefferson when we were mixing and mingling, but I like the fact that when he did meet people both before and after the symposium, he always greeted them by saying, "Hello, citizen." Now, I don't think I can pull that off myself, but it was a really good reminder to me that when I'm interacting with people, especially people with whom I disagree about guns, I need to recognize them as fellow citizens. In the end, we don't have to, and we never will all agree as a 340 million person uh, pluralistic democracy, including people from all different points of view, will never agree on everything. But the key is that we have to disagree with each other respectfully as fellow citizens. And I'll say we also have to get out of our echo chambers. And I really started to do this in 2011 when I got involved in gun culture, because so many gun spaces are traditionally occupied by political conservatives. Becoming a gun owner got me out of my blue bubble. Now, as I've said many times, becoming an armed American didn't make me cease to be a liberal professor, but I've gotten to know more people in these past 12 years who are demographically, politically, ideologically, culturally different from me and my fellow liberals, especially my fellow liberal sociologists. My journey inside American gun culture has allowed me to meet and, in some cases, become friends with many people with whom I have little in common, right? Little in common other than our common citizenship and our common humanity. And I think recognizing that commonality is the most important lesson of all from my journey inside American gun culture. I'm a bit over time relative to the typical webinar. I had a lot to say. This is the last webinar of the series of 7. I really appreciate your time and attention over these past 7 webinars. I've enjoyed preparing them, and I'll miss doing it. I'll miss this engagement, but we hopefully have some time for a final question and answer session. If you have to go at this point, I thank you. If you've been watching this as a streaming video, I thank you for watching to the end. And hopefully I've said something that will inspire you to go out and try to make the world a better place, as they say. All right, so I'm gonna close this presentation so I can get into the Q&A. I see I've got at least 8 questions to work from here. Let me find the questions. I'm going to pop those up here, and I'll take them as they came in. Again, try to answer them as best I can. Let me take a drink here before I get started. Okay, can we share the link to the recordings with other interested parties who didn't register? I mean, I don't know that there's anything that will prevent you from doing that. I don't know if you're not registered for the webinar, whether those links would work or not. As I said, I will be taking the full series and putting them out on my Light Overheat channel this summer. Obviously, I've been collecting the addresses, email addresses of people who registered and adding you all to my newsletter list. There's nothing to prevent you from removing yourself from that list. But this is basically the only price of admission to these webinars was sharing your email address with me. And hopefully you saw when you registered that you agreed to allow me to Sandy's trying to mess me up right now. Allowed me to take that. Sandy is going crazy. Okay. So Mark Erickson, man, Mark, got a couple in there. Let me see what I got. Is associating a morality with guns the result of brainwashing? I mean, I don't actually believe in the concept of brainwashing. This actually comes out of my work as a sociologist of religion. Back when cults or new religious movements were really popular in the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of thought that people were being brainwashed into joining these cults. But there's no real evidence for that, and that most people make decisions. We don't always make fully rational decisions, I think this comes out of behavioral economics and RIP Daniel Kahneman. But we try to make the best decisions possible under limited information, right? So, I think that the other thing is I'm not sure who you're thinking of being brainwashed, but there was certainly a lot of morality associated with guns on January the 6th among people who decided to violently break into the U.S. Capitol building. And who knows what the intention was, but some of them, at least ahead of time, expressed an intention of stopping the steal. So, I think gun owners are just as bad about associating morality with guns as non-gun owners or gun skeptics. And I wouldn't accuse gun owners of being brainwashed, although, this is a very common, trope that we see coming out of the gun control movement, right? That basically gun owners are dupes of the gun industry and the NRA, and that we don't have agency to make decisions in a rational way. So I don't like the idea of brainwashing being used either way on that one. How much of firearms instrumentality is actually defensive? Well, I mean, I think the intentionality cuts both ways, right? That people who are concerned about uh, criminals using guns and the lethality of guns when they're used for criminal purposes, that instrumentality is bad. But again, a lot of the time I've spent wandering around gun culture these past 12 years has been in defensive firearms training classes, and in the defensive firearms community in general. And we're all the time talking about firearms instrumentality, right? It's a force multiplier, right? Old people and women and men of small frame and people who are outnumbered, right? The reason, again, as Tom Gibbons said, the reason why we use firearms for defensive purposes is because they're designed to do that kind of work. So I think it's not a question of how much firearms instrumentality is defensive, right? One of the things, again, that makes firearms paradoxical, right? One of the reasons why firearms aren't inherently good or bad is that a firearm in the hands of a criminal is a bad thing, and the firearm in the hands of legally armed citizen who's acting responsibly is a good thing. Scott Estes, the head of a victim is closer to the line of fire when seated in a car, thus does not account for some of that too. Does that not account for some of that 200% increase? I didn't break it down that way, but I think it's very possible. And again, we don't know what it means to be killed when you're seated in a car. Is it someone who's shooting from outside the car? Is it someone who's sitting next to you in the car? Is it someone who's sitting behind you in the car? um, I think that for me, it really speaks more generally to that issue of intentionality, right? That if you're shooting someone sitting in a car or shooting someone in the head, you are probably, very intent on killing that person, right? Whether you've got, Mac 10 or shotgun or a 5-shot revolver, right? The intentionality probably matters most in that case. Scott Estes again regarding AR-15 shaming. The Washington Post won a Pulitzer very recently for doing essentially that kind of blame, shame in a long series of articles that concluded with an editorial that makes the New York Times look balanced. Yes, one of my friends texted me when the Post won the Pulitzer for that series, and my response to her was, "I'm not surprised." That is the kind of reporting that the Pulitzer Committee really likes. There was, some good things in that series. I actually draw on some of the survey data they have on how many people own how many ARs and why. I actually use that data in my book, but obviously some of the other material is more designed to, blame and shame, as Scott says. They did interview me for that series, and not surprisingly, nothing I had to say about the AR-15 appeared in their reporting. Mark Erickson, you're back. As someone with a position in both tribes, where do you think that cancel culture originates? The division of America makes coming together on controversial issues difficult. Well, I think cancel culture is something that is not the sole property of either conservatives or liberals. I think that liberals want to cancel people who have the wrong views about things, and conservatives also want to cancel people who have the wrong views about things. So we see this happening in the university, where people are reluctant to speak out on certain issues if they feel like they're not swimming with the liberal cultural tide. At the same time, if you look at what's going on in Florida, with the governor and the Board of Education saying what universities in Florida can teach with respect to race, that's cancellation also, from above. So, again, I see both sides of that. And, my wish would be that, nobody gets canceled for expressing, sincere views. That I remember when I was a faculty member in South Bend, Indiana at Notre Dame, and the Klan wanted to march in South Bend. And there were people who said, that's terrible. We don't want the Klan marching in South Bend. We can't give them a platform. And my response was, let them march, right? Organize a counter march, and let them speak so that everybody knows what a racist looks like in flesh and blood. And sure enough, 5 Klansmen marched around, said idiotic things, and well more, multiple times more people came out to counter protest and witness that. So, again, that's my answer to that. Hopefully that's satisfactory. It's a much longer discussion, though. It's a good question. What are some of the ways you think gun owners could be more responsible? I mean, secure your firearms, right? Make sure that people who are unauthorized to access your firearms do not have access to your firearms, whether that's in your home or, for God's sake, quit using your car as a holster, right? There's so many people who are leaving their guns in their cars, and then forgetting that they're in there and going in their house at night. And then when people are roaming neighborhoods, just pulling on car doors, hoping they're going to get some money or some loose change. Or one time Sandy got her N95 mask stolen out of her Prius during COVID. Or if they get lucky, they get an iPad or something. Or if they get really lucky, which they've been getting more and more lucky in recent years, they get a firearm. These firearms go directly into the black market, and they're used for criminal purposes. So, I think that's, probably the biggest way. I also think that, gun owners could do a better job of, policing the bad actions of other gun owners. I hear a lot of times, people, just don't go to public ranges because the unsafe gun handling they see there. It would be great if we developed a culture in which, we could help to sort of instruct and inform people who are acting, poorly. And then also, if people do things publicly, that are stupid or irresponsible with their guns, like, call them out, right? Repost, things that you see that you think are bad examples of gun ownership, so that people can see more good examples of that. I'm sure that other people, have other ideas, but those are some that come immediately to mind for me. Charles Nichols, have you pointed out to concealed carriers that homicides are overwhelmingly committed with concealed weapons? If so, how do they respond? I think that we have to have some clarity in terms of who we're talking about with respect to concealed carriers, right? So very few people who are legally carrying concealed weapons commit homicide. The crime rates among people who are licensed or permitted concealed carriers especially are extraordinarily low, and some estimations even lower than off-duty police officers. Um, so, I think that the reality is that most homicides are committed, if they are committed with concealed weapons, it's criminals who are concealing those weapons. And so, I think the response to concealed carriers, if that was pointed out to them, would be like, well, I'm, a law-abiding, licensed or permitted or concealed carrier, or I'm legally permitted to carry a concealed weapon in a permitless carry state, and those people who are murdering people are criminals. So I think they're kind of two different populations of people we're talking about there. Stephen, that you have. I appreciate the sentiment. Says thanks so much, David. I found informative and thought provoking. That's not a question, but I appreciate it. Thomas Durham, I had a casual conversation with a reporter preparing a piece on American gun culture for the European market. Do you mind if I direct him towards your work? I ask because he might follow up by contacting you directly. Yeah, absolutely. I speak with the media a lot. I take it as one of my responsibilities to represent um, this perspective to anybody who will listen to me. I do talk to the foreign media from time to time. They really have a hard time understanding how Americans relate to firearms. And so I try to represent this idea that guns are normal and normal people use guns, and that we have a very different tradition of understanding the state as monopolizing the authority to use lethal force in self-defense, because the central state in the United States has always delegated some of that authority to private citizens. And so that's just part of our cultural tradition. But yes, I'm definitely always happy to talk to any media, and I appreciate you, speaking to the media as well. I think that a lot of gun owners I know feel like the media is against gun owners, and there is clearly a bias against gun owners in the media. But if responsible and thoughtful gun owners don't speak to the media, then somebody is going to speak to the media. And, I think that the media have almost always treated me fairly. Sometimes you speak for a half an hour and they use one sentence. Sometimes you speak for an hour and they don't use anything except on background. But, I would rather, be in the arena expressing the views of what I think are the best of gun culture, rather than letting them allow the worst of gun culture to come forward. And I've never had a situation where the media has tried to trick me or has used my words against me. And so maybe I've just been lucky, but I haven't been burned, quote unquote, by the media. So that's my point there. Charles Nichols, is John Lott the source of your statistics? He refuses to publish his raw data. No, I mean, the only statistics I use from John Lott are his counts of concealed carry permit holders. He puts out a report every year that sort of just updates those numbers based on the data that he gathers and his estimates. And I think those are, the best data we have on that. Otherwise, I tend to gather my statistics from other scholars who are publishing in the field. Yeah, that's that. Okay, there are no other questions, and so it being almost 7:30, I will say once again, thank you all for participating. Again, I know there's amazing things and interesting conversations happening in the chat. I regret that I can't engage in that, but I appreciate the ability to share some of my thoughts on these issues over the past 7 webinars. I hope you've gotten some value from this. I hope that if you have a chance to pick up my book, Gun Curious, or let somebody you know who might be interested in it know. That's really, helpful to me. And also, please, if you have a chance to read it, let me know what you think, honestly, because, people saying, "Oh, I love the book, it's great," that makes me feel really good. It doesn't help me to advance my thinking. So, if you disagree with me, if you have take issue with either some general points or some specific points I make, or you have a different point of view, please let me know. That way I can sort of get better, or at least take in more points of view into account, because as much as I've journeyed into American gun culture and tried to be thoughtful and reflective about it and tell a story about it that I think is honest, it's just one person's point of view, right? It's an informed point of view, right? But it is just my point of view, and we need, more points of view in order to get a more comprehensive picture. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Be safe, and I'm sure our paths will cross down the road at some point again.